Next, I think, is Rajiv Menon, King's Counsel for Richard Adams.
Good afternoon, sir. Can I just check that you can hear me clearly?
I can hear you very clearly.
I'm grateful. One of the defining features of British policing in the last 50 plus years has been its racism, a racism institutionalized within the structures, systems, policies, practices, and culture of British policing, a racism that has manifested itself in a multitude of different ways, including 1, the over-policing, harassment, maltreatment, and stereotyping of ethnic minority communities. 2, the racially discriminatory use of stop and search powers. 3, the failure to protect ethnic minority communities from racist crime. 4, the excessive and disproportionate use of force against ethnic minority communities. 5, the woefully inadequate response to racist attacks. 6, the deliberate deracialization of racist crime. 7, the criminalization of victims of racist attacks as suspects and perpetrators. 8, the racially disproportionate number of deaths in police custody. And 9, the weaponization of immigration law against ethnic minority communities, asylum seekers, and refugees. Where then does this racist policing originate? How has it come to be so thoroughly embedded in our policing institutions? A quick look at the historical record provides at least one answer. A significant number of senior and rank-and-file police officers, notably after the Second World War, had previously been colonial police officers in India, Ceylon, Malaya, South Africa, Cyprus, Palestine, and elsewhere. During the 20th century, most metropolitan police commissioners and many other senior officers had backgrounds in colonial or military policing, including Sir John Waldron and Peter Brodie, commissioner and assistant commissioner respectively in 1968, when the Special Operations Squad, which later became the Special Demonstration Squad, was set up, who both served in Ceylon, and Sir Kenneth Newman, Chief Constable of the Royal Ulster Constabulary in Northern Ireland from 1976 to 1980, and Commissioner from 1982 to 1987, who served in Palestine. Colonial policing across the British Empire was characterized by racism, brutality, and unaccountability. Colonial police officers enforced racially discriminatory and authoritarian laws. They had paramilitary training and draconian powers, which they used often with impunity. They were rarely, if ever, held to account for abuses of those powers. Undercover surveillance, crowd control, and torture were commonplace. Order trumped law. Any challenge to British rule or British economic interests was sedition. In the circumstances, it is hardly surprising that colonial police officers returning home to join the police in Britain brought with them the racialized practices and political attitudes of colonial policing. During the 1980s, racist policing was arguably at its peak, given the racial inequality in British society and the role of the police in enforcing that inequality through racially differential political policing. The inner city rebellions of 1981 and 1985, at least in part sparked off by violent public order policing, were stark examples of that growing racial divide. Sir Kenneth Newman's reign as Metropolitan Police Commissioner was a particularly grim time, given his persistent targeting and blaming of the Black community, and specifically young Black people, for their opposition to racist policing and for the deterioration of public confidence in the police. But what about undercover policing? Did undercover policing miraculously manage to avoid being tarnished by the scourge of racism? Absolutely not. It is inconceivable that undercover policing was not blighted by the same racism that blighted every other area of policing. And yet this inquiry has barely considered the impact of racism on undercover policing thus far, and risks merely reproducing this blight. That, with all due respect, must end now. The racist murder of Roland Adams and the racist attack on Nathan Adams in February 1991, and the subsequent police spying on the Adams family and their supporters, provide an ideal focal point for this inquiry to address, at long last, the impact of racism on undercover policing and the failure of the undercover police to recognize or tackle the threat posed by the far right and racist criminal groups. They also raise important questions about police corruption and police involvement in organized crime. Roland was not killed in a vacuum. His murder was the tragic culmination of a decade of increasing racist and fascist violence in Southeast London. Racist murders had become an almost annual atrocity. The increase in racist violence coincided with the fascist British National Party moving its headquarters to nearby Welling in 1989. The police, including the undercover police, had failed to combat these crimes in a meaningful way. Indeed, for many in the Black community, the police were very much part of the problem as opposed to a part of the solution. In 1991, Richard and Audrey Adams and their 3 children, Roland aged 15, Nathan aged 14, and Lauren aged 6, lived in Abbey Wood, Southeast London. Richard was a station supervisor at Blackfriars Station. Audrey was a pensions manager at the London Borough of Lewisham. An exceptional woman, she was so keen to give evidence to this inquiry and tell her story, but sadly passed away in February this year. Could we please have the photo of the Adams family of Richard, Nathan, Lauren, and Roland taken in 1988 on the screen, please? I'm grateful. On the 21st of February, 1991, Roland and Nathan played table tennis at Hawksmoor Youth Club in nearby Thamesmead. They left the club and waited at the bus stop to go home. A gang of about 12 to 15 white youths saw them and chased them, some shouting racist abuse. Almost immediately, Roland was fatally stabbed in the throat with a butterfly knife. He started to run, shouting at Nathan to run too. That is how they became separated. Nathan was chased around Thamesmead but managed to escape. When he returned to the scene, he found his brother dying. Roland and Nathan were not the first Black boys to be brutally attacked in the area. Several others had been hospitalized in the months leading up to Roland's tragic murder. There had been a dramatic increase in racist attacks in the area in recent years. This has been well documented by, amongst others, a local community group, the Greenwich Action Committee Against Racial Attacks, GACARA, and also by Greenwich Council's Racial Equality Committee. The attack on Roland and Nathan brought to a head simmering racial tensions and violence, as the attackers were amongst those who had been regularly terrorizing the local Black community. Some called themselves the Nazi Turnouts, NTO, a group also described as the KKK or the Goldfish Gang, and identified by some as something of a British National Party youth group. The NTO used to congregate outside the off-license next to the Wildfowler pub, which was near the Hawksmoor Youth Club. The Wildfowler pub was a well-known meeting point for BNP members and a local center for drug dealing. After Roland's murder, it came to light that a youth leader at the Hawksmoor Youth Club had become increasingly worried about increasing racist violence in the area in the months prior to Roland's murder. She had raised the matter with the police and Greenwich Council, however, neither had taken appropriate action. Richard Adams believes with good cause that had there been effective policing of these earlier attacks, and had the threat posed by the BNP and racist criminal groups been recognized and tackled, the attack on his sons might have been prevented. As it was, the attackers were already known to the police, so it was easy for the police to identify and arrest them. However, most of them were bailed and continued to cause problems. From the very outset, neither the police nor the Crown Prosecution Service would accept that Roland's murder was racially motivated. They deracialized the crime and mischaracterized it as a fight over territory. This has been an age-old problem that victims of racist crime have had to endure, namely a refusal by the police and other public authorities to recognize the racist motives and intentions of racist perpetrators. The police branded Roland and Nathan with the racist stereotype that Black boys cannot be innocent. Nathan was ill-treated by the police. Although he too was attacked, nobody was ever prosecuted for assaulting him. Within weeks of Roland's murder, and for the first time in his life, Nathan started getting harassed and criminalized by the police. He was regularly stopped and searched in the street. He was detained and charged. He was told that he was banned from going to Thamesmead. Of the white youths arrested for Roland's murder, only Mark Thornborough was charged with murder. He stood trial and was convicted. Despite the prosecution deracializing Roland's murder, the trial judge summed up the case on the basis that the murder was racially motivated and sentenced Mark Thornborough accordingly. This was the first official recognition by the state that the murder of Roland Adams was a racist attack. Given the general willingness of the police and the CPS to use the principles of joint enterprise to prosecute as many members of a group as possible on the basis that they assisted or encouraged violence, why did such willingness dissipate when it came to the prosecution of the racists who murdered Roland? The failure to prosecute any of the other attackers with murder is indefensible. After Roland's murder, and in the face of a lack of support from the police and the local authority, Audrey and Richard, together with relatives and friends, formed the Roland Adams Family Campaign to secure justice for Roland. Over the years, the family campaign grew, reaching out to other victims of racist violence and racism. It also played an integral part in efforts to shut down the BNP headquarters and bookshop in Welling. Maybe Mark Thornborough's trial judge learned something about the true nature of Roland's murder from the efforts of the family campaign. Could we please have at this stage the leaflet of the Roland Adams Family Campaign on the screen? Thank you. This is one of many leaflets produced by the Roland Adams Family Campaign. This one advertising a march on the 27th of April, 1991 from Hawksmoor Youth Club in Thamesmead. I'm not going to read out the entire leaflet, sir, because of the time I've been allotted, but you'll note the headlines. Unity is strength. Nothing can stop us from walking the streets, and the struggle continues. Thank you. That leaflet can be taken down. The police were hostile to the family campaign. For months after Roland's murder, the police stopped friends and relatives who came to visit the family, never explaining why. Richard Adams remembers the family liaison officer, P.C. Fisher, visiting the family home unannounced, showing empathy that did not feel real, and trying to tease out information from the family. Meanwhile, the Adams family were receiving threatening calls, with some callers gloating about Roland's murder. They were getting harassed, as were their friends and relatives. So bad was the harassment and so absent was any police protection that the Adams family were advised by the local authority and the local commission for racial equality that they were in danger. They were told to leave their home that night. This they did just 3 months after Roland's murder, and whilst they were still in dreadful shock and mourning. The Adams family asked the inquiry to consider whether, if undercover police activity had been focused on the racists and not on themselves, the family could have been kept safe. In the 33 years since Roland was murdered by racists on the streets of London, the pain, grief, and anger of the Adams family have not diminished. They are angry that only one of Roland's killers was prosecuted and convicted of murder, with 4 others given community service for minor public order offenses. They are angry at the culture of denial that has seen Roland's racist murder largely airbrushed from history. They are angry about today's knife crime crisis that they believe is a manifestation of the police targeting Black youths in the aftermath of increasing racist violence in the 1980s and 1990s. They feel let down by the police, the justice system, and politicians. They believe that if the police had taken decisive action following Roland's murder to tackle racist violence in the area, if the police had turned their intelligence gathering away from them and onto the racists, it is possible that the police could have prevented other racist attacks and murders in the area. They ask whether, for instance, the life of Rohit Dugal, murdered in a racist attack in July 1992, could have been saved. They ask whether, for instance, the racist murder of Stephen Lawrence and the racist attack on Dwayne Brooks in April 1993, which happened in very similar circumstances just a few miles away in Eltham, could have been prevented. And whilst they note that there have been some advances since the 1990s, and racism is taken more seriously in some circles now than it was then, they believe that institutional racism remains endemic in our society and that there remains a toxic culture of racism, one that is more covert and sophisticated than it was 30 or 40 years ago. It is a culture that is even more ominous when it is the culture of those who have power over us, such as the police, operating undercover and hidden from public scrutiny. Richard Adams demands an explanation as to why the police spied on his family, given they were parents who had lost a child and were law-abiding citizens who simply wanted justice for their murdered son. Whether the family campaign was directly targeted for infiltration by the police or indirectly targeted because of its association with other anti-racist groups is neither here nor there. We trust that the inquiry will not be distracted by this red herring. The family of a young boy murdered in a racist attack, who posed absolutely no threat to public order, should never have been spied on by undercover officers. It is disgraceful that they were. Richard questions whether the police would spy on a white family in similar circumstances. Richard would like to add that he and Audrey long believed that they were spied on. Over the years, they had taken steps to limit the intrusion. For example, they stopped using the landlines they thought were bugged. They had nothing to hide, but they had their privacy to protect. When they raised the matter with several agencies, they were made to feel as if they were paranoid and stupid. Confirmation of their fears leads them to ask on whose side is the criminal justice system. They want answers just as much as the inquiry wants answers. They want to know why the SDS was spying on them and not infiltrating racist criminal groups in Southeast London, given these groups were a clear and obvious public order threat, extremely violent, subversive, and politically dangerous. As Richard Adams states in his heartbreaking and thoughtful witness statement, which we commend to the inquiry, Roland was, in his words, quote, slaughtered by racist society, end quote. We must never forget that. Furthermore, we must never forget that the treatment of the Adams family by the police and the prosecuting authorities is emblematic of how our criminal justice system can dehumanize Black people and Black families. That it should include undercover surveillance of the family of a boy murdered in a racist attack heightens the urgency of this inquiry, unequivocally condemning the police for spying on the Adams family. We note the Metropolitan Police Service's belated apology today to the Adams family for the indefensible scrutiny into their lives. We welcome the apology, even though it is more than 30 years late and remains to be given to the family personally. We invite the Metropolitan Police Service to give the apology substance by urgently disclosing any information about the undercover policing or lack of it of racist criminal groups in Southeast London in the 1980s and 1990s, and about any use made of information gathered by police officers purporting to support the Adams family in their time of bereavement. In conclusion, sir, having considered the limited disclosure that they have been provided by the inquiry, the Adams family are puzzled and angry that they know little more now about the nature and extent of the undercover police spying on them than they did when granted core participant status in 2019. They are puzzled and angry that the inquiry appears uninterested in investigating the nature and extent of undercover police spying on racist criminal groups in Southeast London, given it was members of one such group who killed Roland and attacked Nathan. They are puzzled and angry that the inquiry to date has refused to investigate the use of information obtained about the family by their family liaison officer, even though the inquiry has accepted that such an abuse of status can fall within its terms of reference. They are puzzled and angry that the inquiry has only called one undercover officer in an open hearing who infiltrated the far right, namely HN56, and he, for some inexplicable reason, was deployed to infiltrate a largely inactive BNP branch in Loughton, Essex. They are puzzled and angry that they are none the wiser about the nature and extent of undercover policing of the far right more generally, and will remain none the wiser, given this is apparently to be considered in secret hearings from which they, all other non-state core participants, and the public are excluded, and given the inquiry has thus far forbidden any questions being asked of any police witness in open hearings about the nature and extent of police spying on the far right. They are puzzled and angry that the inquiry has not provided any adequate explanation as to why such an extraordinary course of action is being taken in what is supposed to be a public inquiry into undercover policing. On behalf of the Adams family, we ask the inquiry to reconsider its approach to the undercover policing of the far right and racist criminal groups, and provide the non-state court participants with a proper explanation for all this secrecy. Otherwise, effective participation in the inquiry is being denied. Thank you.
Thank you very much. May I make two observations to you and to the family that you represent? One observation to you and to them, and then another matter entirely. As the inquiry has stated, right-wing groups were the subject of infiltration by the Undercover Police Unit between the 1980s and the closure of the unit. However, for reasons that I would hope would be obvious to those that you represent, those deployments have got to be considered in closed session. I'm not asking for a response to that. I've heard what you've said, but I want those behind you in particular to understand the reasons for the inquiry's approach. The second concerns another matter entirely. I know you have another opening submission to make to me tomorrow on behalf of a separate group. Could I ask you to reconsider paragraph 8 of that submission, that written submission, when I believe you have made a mistaken identification?
I will look at that overnight, sir.
Yes.
And I won't respond to the point about the far right. You know what our submissions on that are, and I don't think I need to repeat them.
No, indeed not. No, your position is very clearly stated. I hope that those behind you understand the position of the inquiry, which I have repeated on a number of occasions now. But thank you very much indeed for the economy with which you've made your opening submissions. I'm grateful to you. Thank you.